Rain fell like sheets of ice on the devastated trenches of the planet Dravok. Distant explosions lit up the purple sky, and the air was saturated with the smell of ozone and burnt metal. Kyle adjusted his helmet visor, watching the horizon through the fog. The mission was simple on paper. Infiltrate the Draken Empire's main fortress, rescue the human prisoners, and extract them safely. Of course, missions were never so simple in practice. Alpha Team, confirm positions, Kyle muttered, his voice muffled by the communicator. He was lying in a crater, surrounded by the remains of downed drones and the wreckage of armored vehicles. The fortress was less than 500 meters ahead, protected by watchtowers and robotic patrols. Delta positioned on the southern perimeter, replied Leon, his second-in-command. No suspicious movement so far. Good. Move with caution. The last report indicated that the Drakons were reinforcing security. Kale began to crawl towards the next cover, feeling the weight of the gravity rifle on his back. He knew that every second counted. The prisoners were in danger, but he hadn't expected to find an alien rebel in his path. The cell was cold and dark, lit only by a thread of blue light seeping through the bars. Licia was lying on the floor, her arms cuffed behind her head, her eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. Her breathing was steady, but her mind was buzzing with thoughts. She had been captured during a surprise attack by the Drakons against her group of rebels. It was only a matter of time before they tried to interrogate, or worse, execute her. But she wasn't known as the Resistance Blade by chance. The cell door creaked open, snapping Licia out of her thoughts. An imposing Drakon entered, carrying a staff of energy that crackled with electricity. He smiled, his sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. Ready to cooperate, Licia? His voice was a mixture of contempt and expectation. You know what the answer is, she retorted, her voice firm. Ah, still full of spirit. Let's see how long that lasts. Before he could take the next step, a bang echoed down the corridor. The light flickered, and an explosion shook the building. The Drakon staggered, his gaze turning towards the prison entrance. Licia took advantage of the distraction. Even though she was handcuffed, she turned her body and launched a kick that hit the Drakon's knee, knocking him to the ground. With quick movements, she took the key to her handcuffs from his belt and began working to free herself. Kyle led his team through the smoky corridors of the fortress, taking out robotic guards with calculated precision. The sound of boots echoed through the complex as he and Leon cleared each sector in search of the prisoners. Kyle, we've got movement in the East Wing, warned Leon. Cameras caught something. Probably a patrolman, Kyle replied, adjusting the display to thermal mode. Let's investigate. They turned a corner and saw a tall figure with tanned skin and black hair fighting two Drakons. She wore torn clothes, but her movements were fluid, almost elegant, as she dodged blows and counterattacked with sheer determination. Who is she? Leon asked, surprised. I don't know, Kyle replied, raising his rifle. But she's not our enemy. He fired, hitting one of the Drakons directly in the head. The other turned around, confused, only to be shot by Leon. The mysterious figure looked at the two human soldiers, his breathing heavy. You're not Drakons, she said, analyzing them. Who are you? Kale slowly lowered his weapon. We're from the Earth Alliance. We're here to rescue human prisoners. You won't make it alone, she replied. I'm Licia, and I know this fortress better than anyone. If you want to get out alive, you'll need my help. Kale hesitated. He didn't trust easily, especially an alien captured by the Drakons. But there was something in her eyes, a mixture of pain and determination, that made him reconsider. Surely you know that working with us can be dangerous, Kyle said. No more dangerous than staying here, Licia replied. The choice is yours, human. He nodded. All right, Licia, but any betrayal, and you will be my problem. Understood? She smiled, a smile full of defiance. Understood. Now, let's get out of here before the reinforcements arrive. And so, the unlikely trio made their way through the destroyed corridors, each step marked by distrust and tension. What Kyle didn't know was that Licia's presence would not only change the mission, but also his own perception of who the enemies and allies really were. The muffled sound of boots against metal echoed as Kale led the group down a narrow corridor, the walls stained with soot from recent explosions. He stared ahead, concentrated, the gravity rifle ready in his hands. Behind him, Leon guarded the rear, while Lycia stood in the middle, her watchful eyes scanning her surroundings. Although her posture conveyed calm, Kale could tell that she was always ready to act, like a compressed spring waiting for the right moment to spring. They were halfway to the area where the human prisoners were being held, according to the maps obtained by the Earth Alliance. The path, however, was a maze of poorly lit corridors and hidden traps. Kyle knew that one mistake could mean the failure of the mission. More than that, it would mean death. Lycia stopped abruptly. She raised her hand, a gesture that made Kyle and Leon freeze at the same moment. Without saying a word, she pointed to a junction ahead. Kyle followed the movement with his eyes and adjusted the thermal display. 3 humanoid shapes glowed on the other side of the bend, armed and patrolling the corridor like predators on the prowl. He gestured with his fingers to Leon. 2 targets on the right, 1 on the left. Lycia, watching the movement, tilted her head slightly as if assessing the plan. Then, without warning, she moved. Quick as lightning, she slid down the corridor wall, keeping out of sight of the patrolman. Kyle had no time to protest. "Leon, cover," he muttered, and they both moved in right behind her. The Drakon patrolmen were brutal in combat, but slow to react. Lycia was already on top of the first one when the other 2 noticed. With one fluid movement, she drove a makeshift blade, probably taken from some debris, into the neck of one Drakon, knocking him out instantly. The second turned towards her, but didn't stand a chance. A precise shot from Kyle's rifle hit him in the chest. The third started to raise his weapon but was shot down by Leon before he could even aim. Kale stepped forward, checking the bodies. "Are you suicidal or just reckless?" he asked, more to himself than to Lycia. She just wiped the blood from her blade on the uniform of one of the Drakons. They were occupying the vantage point. "We needed to act." Kale didn't reply. There was logic in her actions, but that didn't diminish the irritation he felt at having lost control of the situation. He nodded for them to continue, and the group resumed their journey. The room where the prisoners were being held was protected by an advanced security panel, with a constantly changing sequence of codes. Kale approached the door, studying the mechanism. The electronic frequencies were complex, but he had a device in his armor designed to decipher them. "Time is against us," said Leon, adjusting his position to cover the corridor behind them. "It takes a few minutes," replied Kale as he connected the device. The display screen showed the progress, numbers and symbols dancing in a frantic pattern. Lycia, who was standing a little way back, crossed her arms. "We don't have any minutes. This wing's security system is connected directly to the Drakon's command room. They know we're here." Kyle didn't look up. "And what do you suggest? Going through the wall?" "Actually, yes." She moved to the left side of the door, where a ventilation grill emitted a slight hum. Without hesitating, Lycia ripped the grill with force, exposing a narrow tunnel. Kyle looked at her in disbelief. "Really? You think we're going to squeeze through that?" "It's how I escaped from the interrogation wing," Lycia replied with an impassive tone. "This tunnel leads directly into the room. You can try to decode the door while I go in behind and deactivate the system." Leon exchanged a look with Kyle, clearly torn between skepticism and pragmatism. Kale clenched his jaw. He hated relying on a makeshift plan, especially one coming from someone he barely knew, but he saw no other option. "Make it quick," he said, and Lycia entered the tunnel without hesitation. Time seemed to drag on as Kyle and Leon waited, both tense. Kale's helmet display indicated activity in the corridor, but no immediate movement. He continued to monitor the decoding device. Progress was at 87%. He almost wished that Lycia would succeed, even if it meant admitting that her plan was better. Suddenly, there was a metallic popping sound and a loud click. The door opened slowly, revealing a room full of human prisoners crammed into cells. Lycia was on the other side, next to the control panel, holding the bloody blade. She wiped the sweat from her brow and looked at Kyle with an expression bordering on triumph. "It took me less time than your decoder," she commented, before moving to free the prisoners. Kyle let the comment pass. He and Leon quickly began helping the humans out of their cells. The exhausted and thin faces of the prisoners showed the level of suffering they had endured, but luckily for them, most of them could still walk. Lycia, however, seemed focused on something else. "These aren't all of them," she said, looking around. "Where are the others?" Kale stopped, frowning. "Others? The Drakons always divide prisoners into two groups, one for forced labor, the other for experiments. This," she gestured to the rescued, "is the least priority group. The others are in an isolated wing." "Damn it," muttered Kyle. He knew he couldn't leave anyone behind, but the mission was already dangerously close to failure. "You can take them to the extraction point," suggested Lycia, meeting his gaze. "I can go after the others." Kyle hesitated. The idea of splitting up the group wasn't ideal, but time was running out. "You have 5 minutes," he finally said. "After that, we're leaving, with or without you." Lycia nodded, a flash of determination crossing her face, and disappeared down another corridor. Kyle and Leon led the prisoners through the routes they had mapped out for the extraction. Each step seemed like an eternity. The sound of alarms echoed, adding to the urgency. They finally reached the rendezvous point, a large room with an opening to the outside where a stealth transport awaited them. "Alpha to base," Kyle communicated. "Extraction in progress. Prepare reinforcements, if necessary." The prisoners began to board, but Kale couldn't help glancing at the empty corridor behind them, hoping to see Lycia emerge. Leon noticed. "She knew the risks, Kale." "I know," he replied, but the words sounded empty. The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the conversation. Lycia appeared, with 5 other prisoners, human and alien, all wounded, but alive. She looked exhausted, but the gleam in her eyes was unmistakable. "I told you there were more," she said, panting. Kyle couldn't help but smile, however briefly. "You're good. I'll give you that." The last prisoners boarded, and the transport began to take off. As the group left the fortress behind, Kyle looked at Lycia, who was sitting quietly in the corner. For the first time, he realized that she wasn't just an unlikely ally, but someone he could count on, at least for the time being. The light from the transport flickered intermittently as they crossed the turbulent atmosphere of Dravok. Outside, the purple sky was streaked with lightning that illuminated the planet's metallic mountains. Kale was in the cockpit, watching the monitors and making sure they were out of immediate danger. He felt the weight of the mission on his shoulders, but he also knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Behind him, the cabin was crammed with released prisoners, many in silence, their expressions marked by exhaustion and trauma. Leon was sitting on a bench, cleaning his gun, while his eyes constantly checked the entrance to the cabin, as if expecting an attack at any moment. And then there was Lycia. She was in the far corner, one leg folded under her body and her arms crossed. Her eyes were closed, but Kyle doubted she was resting. Her breathing was regular, but the tension in her body was obvious, a fighting machine always ready for the next move. Kyle felt a twinge of discomfort. He knew that Lycia had risked a lot by going back for the last prisoners. It was an act that no human commander would have ordered, but she had done it on her own. This intrigued and irritated him in equal measure. There was something about her determination that disarmed him. The transport began to slow down as it approached the Earth Alliance's base of operations. It was a makeshift complex, hidden in a rocky crevice, to avoid Drakon sensors. Kyle landed the ship with precision, and the sound of the engines shutting down brought palpable relief to everyone on board. "Everyone out," Kyle ordered, without raising his voice, but firmly enough for the group to move quickly. He turned to Leon. "Take them to the medical section. Make a report on each one's condition." Leon nodded and began organizing the prisoners, guiding them to the main entrance. Kyle watched as the tired faces disappeared one by one. When everyone had gone, he noticed that Lycia remained where she was, her gaze lost somewhere on the floor. "You too," said Kyle, walking towards her. She looked up, and Kale could see the depth in her gaze, a mixture of tiredness, pain, and something else he couldn't identify. Without saying anything, she got up and headed for the exit, but stopped next to him. "You did the right thing," Kale said. It wasn't a compliment, but a realization. "I know," replied Lycia, with no apparent emotion, before disappearing into the darkness of the corridor. Hours passed, and Kale was back in the command center. The holographic maps projected the movements of the Drakon forces in the region, and he carefully analyzed the data. Every second, the enemies reorganized, and the Alliance base wouldn't remain safe for long. They needed to evacuate before they were located. "The Drakons have reinforced the perimeter in a 20-kilometer radius," said Leon, pointing to the red indicators on the map. "They're moving mechanized troops in. I think they want to retake the fortress we just attacked." Kale ran a hand through his hair, feeling tired. "If they're prioritizing the fortress, that gives us an opening. We need to move all the prisoners to the extraction point before they notice our movement." Leon nodded. "I'll organize the squads." Before he could leave, Lycia entered the room. Now dressed in a makeshift uniform provided by the Alliance, she looked less wild, but no less dangerous. Kyle watched as she approached the map, his eyes analyzing the data with almost predatory precision. "You don't have enough time," she said, pointing to an isolated sector on the hologram. "The Drakons have an advance patrol here. They'll intercept your route before you reach the extraction point." Kale frowned. "How do you know that? The map shows no activity there." "Because I know my enemy," Lycia replied, crossing her arms, "and they don't follow obvious patterns. If they want to survive, they need a distraction." Leon looked at Kyle, waiting for a decision. He knew that the commander didn't fully trust Lycia, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that she was right either. "So, what's the plan, Lycia?" asked Kyle, his voice laden with caution. "I'll create the distraction," she said, without hesitation. "I'll lead the Drakon troops away from the extraction route. You'll have all the time you need." "That's suicide," Kale replied. He didn't want to admit it, but the thought of losing Lycia, despite everything, bothered him. "It's necessary," she retorted, looking directly at him. "You have no other choice." The plan was quickly put into action. While the prisoners were being prepared for evacuation, Lycia equipped herself with weapons and explosives provided by the Alliance. Kyle watched her from a distance, fighting the growing feeling that something was wrong. When she had finished, he approached. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say, but he felt he had to. "You don't have to do this alone," he said at last. Lycia gave him a small, almost sad smile. "I've always done everything myself, Kale. This is no different." Kale opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the sound of alarms. The base's sensors had detected Drakon activity nearby. It was time to act. "Good luck," he said at last. Lycia merely nodded before disappearing into the night. The distraction worked better than Kyle expected, and also worse. The Drakons fell into Lycia's trap, and the way to the extraction point was clear. But the intensity of the fighting in her sector was alarming. Reports on the communication channel indicated massive explosions and direct confrontation. Kale tried to concentrate on the evacuation, but his mind kept returning to Lycia. The prisoners had been loaded onto the transports, and Leon was supervising the takeoff. Kale, however, didn't get on the ship. "Kale, what are you doing?" asked Leon, noticing his absence on the last transport. "I can't leave her behind," replied Kale, adjusting his rifle. "That's not part of the plan," insisted Leon. "I know," replied Kale, before disappearing into the shadows. Kale advanced through the dark terrain, the sounds of combat intensifying as he got closer. He found the signs of destruction left by Lycia, burning Drakon vehicles, downed soldiers, and detonated traps, but he couldn't find her. Then, in the middle of a debris field, he saw her. Lycia was kneeling, leaning on a pile of twisted metal, blood dripping from a deep gash in her shoulder. Around her, Drakon bodies were scattered as if a storm had passed through. Kyle ran over to her, kneeling beside her. "I told you that was suicide." She looked up, a tired smile on her lips. "And yet, here you are." Without saying another word, He helped her to her feet. "Let's get out of here," he said firmly. Despite the obvious pain, Lycia managed to keep pace with Kyle as they made their way back to the extraction zone. He carried her the last few meters, while distant explosions lit up the horizon. When they finally reached the shuttle, Lycia looked at him, her eyes settling on his for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said, before falling asleep, exhausted. The transport cut through the sky, silent and fast, leaving behind the chaos of Drevok. Kale was in the pilot's seat, checking the ship's monitors and systems. The display showed stable readings. All the prisoners were on board, alive, and the airspace looked clear, for now. But his mind wasn't on the monitors. His thoughts were fixed on Lycia. She was in the makeshift medical cabin, receiving care from the team. Despite her wounds, she had survived. Kale couldn't decide whether that was a relief or a problem. Lycia was a mystery, a piece out of place, and he hated not understanding something. More than that, he hated what he was beginning to feel for her. In the medical cabin, Lycia woke up with a slight tremor in her transport. The light above her was cold and white, and the muffled sound of the engines filled the room. Her wounds had been treated, but her body still ached, as if it had been run over by a tank. She tried to sit up, but a firm hand pushed her back. "You should rest," said Leon, without taking his eyes off the monitor beside him. Lycia raised an eyebrow. "You look worried." "Not for you," he replied dryly, "but Kyle seems to be. He defied orders to go after you. That's not common." She narrowed her eyes, trying to hide the slight discomfort she felt at those words. She wasn't used to anyone risking their life for her, let alone a human. Before she could reply, Leon stood up. "I'll let you know you're awake." He left, leaving Lycia alone with her thoughts. Kale appeared a few minutes later, his expression serious. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if considering his words before entering. Finally, he walked over to her bedside. "You're terrible at following orders," he said, his voice low but laced with implication. Lycia gave a weak smile. "And you're not as bad as you look." Kyle shook his head. "You almost died. You didn't have to be so reckless." "If I wasn't reckless, you and your prisoners would still be in the fortress," she retorted firmly. He had no answer to that, so he just nodded. "We're going to the Alliance's orbital base. There you can decide what to do next." "What to do next?" She stared at him. "I still have a fight to finish, human, and so do you." Hours later, the transport arrived at the orbital base, a gigantic ring of metal floating in orbit. It was the Alliance's center of operations for that region of the galaxy, and also the place where Kyle could finally report on the mission. Prisoners were escorted to the medical wing and accommodated in secure areas. Meanwhile, Lycia was taken to separate quarters to avoid unwanted interactions with the survivors who were still suspicious of aliens. Kyle was in a command room, updating his superiors on the mission. Holographic maps showed the movements of the Drakon forces, now more active and aggressive since the rescue operation. The holographic general's voice sounded cold and direct. "You have brought valuable information, Commander, but the Drakons now know we're here. They will react." Kyle crossed his arms. "Then we need to move fast. We have prisoners to evacuate and allies who can be useful." He paused. "Including Lycia." "That alien?" The general frowned. "She's a risk, Kyle. It's enough that you put your team in danger to rescue her." "She saved lives," Kale retorted. "If it hadn't been for her, half the prisoners wouldn't have survived. She knows the Drakons better than anyone here." There was a long pause before the general replied. "Very well, but she's under your responsibility. If anything goes wrong, you'll be the only one to blame." Kale found Lycia in a simple lodging, watching the view from the window. The vastness of the space seemed to mesmerize her, but her posture was still alert. He approached, crossing his arms. "You're under my responsibility now," he said directly. She laughed softly, without turning towards him. "I feel so safe." Kale sighed. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. I don't trust you completely, but I know we need you." She finally turned, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't trust me, but you saved me." "Why?" He hesitated, the words forming slowly. Because you risked everything to save those prisoners. That means something. Lycia tilted her head, appraising him. Maybe you're more human than I thought. That night, Kyle reviewed reports and studied the data on the Draken offensive. Their movements were accelerating, and the number of troops indicated that a large-scale attack was imminent. He knew that the orbital base couldn't withstand a prolonged siege. They needed to evacuate before it was too late. As he worked, his mind kept returning to Lycia. Something about her bothered him and fascinated him. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Strong, determined, but she also carried a pain that he couldn't ignore. There was something else about her, something he still didn't understand, but wanted to find out. The evacuation was scheduled for dawn, standard orbital base time. Kale organized the teams and planned the escape routes, ensuring that each group had adequate protection. Lycia would be put on the last transport, along with him, to keep a direct check on her presence. Shortly before departure, she appeared in the hangar, observing the movement. Kyle approached, crossing his arms as he stared at her. "Are you ready for another battle?" he asked. "I always am," replied Lycia, with a slight smile. Kyle noticed that the smile was different. There was no sarcasm, just a silent acceptance of what was to come. He knew the war was far from over, but for the first time he felt he wasn't fighting alone. The alarm sounded, signaling the start of the evacuation. Kyle and Lycia boarded the transport, ready to face the next challenge. As the doors closed, Kyle looked at her and, for the first time, saw more than a rebel. He saw an ally, and perhaps something more. The evacuation began under the pale glow of distant stars, but the feeling was one of haste and tension. The transport, loaded with rescued prisoners and exhausted soldiers, advanced through space in formation with 4 other Alliance vehicles. Each ship was protected by escort drones, flying like swarms of bees, ready to intercept any Draken threat. The plan was clear: head for the jump point, enter hyperspace, and reach the next safe base. Kyle was in the cockpit, analyzing the monitors that tracked the fleet. Every few moments, his eyes flicked to the radar, looking for signs of pursuit. The silence was oppressive, interrupted only by the constant hum of the engines. Something seemed wrong. "Contact in Sector 6, announced the voice of the pilot of the lead transport over the communication channel. 3 Draken ships emerging from hyperspace. Kyle cursed silently. He had expected the Drakens to try something, but not so soon. The Alliance fleet hadn't reached the jump point yet. "All transports, activate full shields," Kyle ordered over the radio. "Drones, take up defensive positions. We can't stop now." The monitors showed the red icons of Draken ships approaching rapidly. The enemy ships were smaller, made for speed and attack, but carried enough weaponry to destroy an unprotected transport with a single shot. In the main cabin, Lycia was sitting in the back, watching space through a small window. When the emergency lights started flashing and the prisoner's nervous whispers increased, she knew something had gone wrong. A soldier ran past, carrying a rifle. Lycia stood up, her body reacting instinctively to the danger. She walked to the corridor, where she found Kale emerging from the cockpit, his countenance as grim as ever. "Drakons?" she asked bluntly. Kale confirmed with a gesture. "They're coming after us. We're holding back for now, but if they reach us before the jump-off point..." He left the sentence hanging in the air, but the meaning was clear. "How long until the jump?" she asked, following him down the corridor. 5 minutes. Enough time for a disaster," Kyle replied, glancing at the monitors on the wall panel. The defensive drones were already engaged in combat, but the Drakons were still advancing. In space, the Drakon ships sliced through the void like predators, firing plasma projectiles that exploded against the transport's shields. The Alliance drones fought back, but they were outnumbered. One of the Drakon ships managed to break through the formation, firing directly at the lead transport. "Transports 2 and 3, fall back to cover the leader," Kale ordered over the radio, his voice firm. "We can't afford to lose any ships." In the middle of the chaos, Lycia appeared in the cockpit. She leaned over Kale's shoulder, looking at the monitors. They're forcing the drones to disperse. It's tactical. Their fleet leader wants to split us up. I know, Kale replied, his teeth clenched. But there's not much we can do. If we go off course, we'll never reach the jump point in time. Lycia watched the monitors for a moment, then looked at him. You need a detour. Kale turned to her, his eyes fixed on hers. What are you suggesting? I can take a shuttle, said Lycia, pointing to the small escort ship attached to the underside of the transport. If I lure the Drakons away, you'll have a chance. Kyle frowned. It's suicide. Maybe, she said, with a slight smile. But you know I'm right. Kale wanted to protest, but there was no time. He knew that Lycia was willing to take that risk, and part of him hated the fact that she was probably more prepared for it than anyone else on the ship. 20 minutes ago, I would have let you go without hesitation, he said at last. Now, I'm not so sure. 20 minutes ago, you were smarter, she retorted, moving towards the shuttle's access hatch. Lycia entered the small craft and took the controls with ease, as if she had piloted something like this before. The engine rumbled softly as she released it from the transport structure. The moment she stepped out, a series of Drakon blasts exploded near her. Come after me, you cowards, muttered Lycia, moving the ship in a daring maneuver that cut off the trajectory of the enemy ships. The Drakons took the bait. The three ships sped towards Lycia's ship, leaving the transports behind. She knew she couldn't engage them directly. The shuttle had limited weaponry, but she could keep up the pursuit as long as possible. In the transport, Kale watched the monitors as the Drakon ships disappeared from firing range. The tension in his shoulders eased, but only a little. She did it, said Leon, appearing beside him. Kale nodded, but didn't reply. He felt a weight on his chest that he couldn't ignore. Lycia might be strong and determined, but she was still a person facing impossible odds. He hated the idea of leaving her behind. Lycia flew as if she were dancing, guiding the ship through a series of maneuvers that forced the Drakons to react. Her fingers moved quickly across the controls, activating countermeasures and releasing distraction explosives. Despite being alone, she felt a calm that almost surprised her. The Drakons were becoming more and more aggressive, and one of their shots hit the side of the ship, shaking it violently. Lycia gripped the controls, struggling to stabilize the trajectory. I'm still here, she muttered to herself, looking at the last two explosives she had available. She knew she only had to hold on for a few more minutes. Back in the transport, Kale watched the jump counter. 30 seconds. Time seemed to slow down as he looked at the radar, waiting for Lycia to reappear. Kyle, said Leon in an undertone. We need to jump. I know, he replied, his eyes fixed on the monitor. The counter reached 5 seconds, and Kyle pressed the controls. The transport entered hyperspace, along with the rest of the fleet. The stars on the display distorted into lines of light, and silence overtook the cabin. Kyle closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the adrenaline rush subside, but his mind was still on Lycia. She had sacrificed herself to give them a chance, and now he didn't know if she was still alive. In space, Lycia's shuttle was on fire, but still functional. She had used the last explosives to destroy 2 of the Drakon ships, and the last one was retreating, probably to report what had happened. Lycia smiled, even though she was exhausted. She had succeeded. With effort, she turned the ship and pointed at the coordinates of the Alliance jump. The panel flashed with system alarms, but she knew she had one chance. Just one. They owe me, she muttered, activating the hyperdrive. As the ship disappeared into the void of space, Lycia thought of Kyle. Not because she expected a thank you, but because, for the first time in a long time, she felt that there was something, or someone, waiting for her. The jump through hyperspace seemed endless to Kale. The vast window in the cockpit showed only the bright lines of distorted stars, but he barely noticed them. His focus was on a single point, Lycia. He knew that she had created an opening for the fleet to escape, but her sacrifice had been unnecessarily risky. She knew it, and he knew it. As the transport followed the set route, Kale checked the monitors, hoping to pick up any signal from his shuttle. Nothing. The void on the radar seemed to mock him, every second without a ping, feeding the anxiety growing in the pit of his stomach. Leon entered the cockpit in silence, holding a tablet with the survivor's report. "Everyone is stable," he said, with practiced calm. "No serious injuries among the prisoners. They are being accommodated in the dormitories of the target base." Cale merely nodded, his eyes still fixed on the monitors. "She knew what she was doing," Leon continued, moving closer. "Lycia may have been reckless, but without her, we wouldn't be here." "I know," replied Kyle, his voice low, "but that doesn't mean I have to accept it." In the shuttle, Lycia was hanging between life and death, and literally between the stars. The panel flashed frantically with alerts. The hyperdrive had worked, but the ship was on the verge of complete failure. She had managed to get out of the Drakon sector, but she was still a long way from any safe zone. Breathing hard, Lycia forced herself to check the systems. The shields were offline, the weapons had been rendered useless, and the oxygen was slowly decreasing. She knew she had few options. Finding Kyle and his fleet was her only chance. She activated the emergency transmitter, setting it to broadcast a signal on all known Alliance frequencies. "This is Lycia," she said, her voice hoarse. "If anyone's listening, my ship is severely damaged. Coordinates attached. I need assistance." The effort of speaking drained her strength, and Lycia sank into her seat. She stared at the infinite space in front of her and closed her eyes, trying to ignore the tiredness that threatened to overwhelm her. Kyle was about to give up monitoring the systems when the radar beeped. He straightened up in his chair, his eyes wide. A transmission had entered the system, faint and almost inaudible, but clearly an emergency message. "We've got something," Kyle announced, leaning over the controls to amplify the signal. The sound crackled before stabilizing, revealing a familiar voice. "Lycia," he muttered, almost in disbelief. "Position marked," said Leon, immediately examining the coordinates attached to the message. "She's 3 sectors away, but we don't have the resources to divert the main transport." "I didn't ask for a detour," replied Kyle, standing up. "Take over from here. I'm going after her." "Kyle," Leon began, but stopped when he saw the determined look on the commander's face. "Just don't die," he added resignedly. The patrol ship Kyle had chosen was fast, designed for short-range chases and rescues. He was alone, moving quickly along the plotted routes. Communication with the main transport had been cut off to avoid Drakon detection, and Kyle used only basic instruments for navigation. The silence in the cabin was disturbing, but he was used to it. There was a clarity in the isolation, a focus that he couldn't find in the heat of combat. Even so, his mind wandered to Lycia. There was no logical reason for him to be so worried about her. They had started out as reluctant enemies, allies only for convenience. So why did he feel like he was going after something else? The panel flashed with an update. He was close to the coordinates provided by Lycia. His ship slowed down as he scanned the surrounding space. Finally, he spotted something, a weak spot in the darkness. A shuttlecraft floating aimlessly. Kyle approached it slowly, analyzing its systems. The power was almost exhausted, and the vital signs on board were weak but stable. He let out a sigh of relief and activated the communication channel. "Lycia, it's me. I'm here." No response. Kyle maneuvered his ship to dock with hers. The process was tense and slow, but he finally managed to establish a connection. When the door opened, he entered Lycia's cabin. The air was heavy, the lighting flickering. She was slumped in her seat, her body tilted uncomfortably. Kyle approached, checking her vital signs with a portable device. She was alive, but clearly on the edge. Without wasting any time, he unbuckled her and lifted her into his arms. "You're not going to die here," he muttered, carrying her back to his ship. When Lycia woke up, everything was a blur. The first thing she noticed was the rhythmic sound of medical monitors. Then, the cold touch of a sheet against her skin. Finally, she saw Kyle's face. He was sitting next to her, his head resting on one hand, looking more tired than ever. "You're here," she said, her voice weak. "Of course I am," he replied, without raising his eyes. Did you really think I was going to let you die in space? It would be easier, she joked, a faint smile appearing on her lips. Cale finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that Licia hadn't expected. Genuine concern, maybe even something more. Easy was never your style, he said after a pause. Now get some rest. We're far from out of the woods. As Kyle's ship returned to the rendezvous point with the fleet, he reviewed the systems to make sure they hadn't been followed. Licia, despite her condition, insisted on sitting in the co-pilot's seat, watching him work. "You really didn't have to come after me," she said, after a long silence. "I know," he replied, without taking his eyes off the controls, "but I did it anyway." Licia studied his profile for a moment. There was something about Kyle that had intrigued her from the start. He was efficient, practical, but now she saw a side that he didn't show anyone. A side that, to her surprise, made her feel less alone. "Thank you," she said at last. Kyle looked at her and gave a slight smile. "You've said that before, and it looks like I'm going to have to keep saying it," replied Licia, with a glint of humor in her eyes. They continued in silence, but something changed between them. A silent understanding, a connection that didn't need to be said. And, for the first time, Cale felt that the war they were facing was not only against the Dracons, but also against the barriers they had erected around themselves. The patrol ship slowed as the Alliance fleet appeared on the starry horizon, a cluster of ships orbiting around a small space station. Kyle adjusted the controls, preparing to dock. Beside him, Licia was alert, although she still looked exhausted. Her injuries had been hastily treated during the flight, and her expression was a mixture of tiredness and something else. Perhaps resignation. "What happens now?" she asked, breaking the silence. Kyle squinted at her. "First, you rest. Then, we have a bigger problem to solve." Licia arched an eyebrow. "Bigger problem? You mean the Dracons?" Kyle nodded. "They know where we are, and if we don't act fast, they'll have us cornered before we can react." The ship slowly approached the largest of the fleet's ships, an Alliance cruiser called Star Watch. Kale sent the access codes and waited for confirmation. Meanwhile, Licia watched the panel, her mind clearly elsewhere. "I don't belong here," she muttered, almost to herself. Cale didn't reply immediately. He knew what she meant. She was a rebel in a territory that wasn't hers, fighting alongside people who didn't trust her. But even so, he couldn't deny that her presence had changed the course of the mission. And perhaps, more than that, "You belong where you choose to be," he said at last. "And now, that's here." As soon as the ship docked, Kyle and Licia were met by Leon and a group of Alliance soldiers. Leon looked at Cale with a mixture of relief and irritation. "You like getting into trouble, don't you?" Leon said, while quickly checking the commander's condition. "The whole fleet was on alert waiting for you." Kyle ignored the comment, walking past him and signaling for Licia to follow. They walked through the corridors of the Star Watch, where rescued prisoners were being attended to. The curious and suspicious looks Licia received did not go unnoticed. Some soldiers whispered, others frowned. She ignored them, holding her head high. Cale led her into an empty meeting room. He entered a code on the panel to seal the door, ensuring privacy. When he turned around, Licia was standing in the middle of the room, her arms crossed and her expression serious. "Why am I here, Kyle?" she asked bluntly. "Because we need you," he replied, without hesitation. Licia laughed, a dry, disbelieving sound. "You need me? You have a whole fleet of soldiers and advanced weaponry. What can a rebel like me offer?" Kyle stepped forward, his face serious. "You know the Dracons better than anyone in this fleet, their movements, their strategies, and now, more than ever, we need the upper hand." She narrowed her eyes. "And what's in it for me?" Kyle didn't look away. "The chance to win." There was a long silence. Licia finally nodded, but her gaze showed that she wasn't completely convinced. "Then tell me what the plan is." Cale gathered his main team in the command room. Leon was at his side, along with Star Watch's head of strategy, a short, methodical man called Arlen. Licia stood at the back of the room, her eyes fixed on the central hologram that projected the space region. Red dots represented the Drakons, moving like predators around the Alliance's safe areas. "The Drakons are concentrating here," said Arlen, pointing to a section of the hologram. "They're blocking the fleet's main escape route. If we stay here any longer, we'll be surrounded." "They're pressuring us to make a hasty jump," said Leon, "and if we're careless, they'll intercept us in hyperspace." Kel looked at Lycia. "What do you see?" She walked over to the hologram, leaning over the projection. Her eyes scanned the red dots, observing the patterns of movement. After a few seconds, she pointed to a small gap in the Drakon formation. "Here," she said, "that sector is vulnerable. The Drakons are confident that no one will try to get through there, because it looks like a dead end." "Because it is a dead end," Arlen retorted. "Those coordinates lead directly to a debris field that could destroy large ships." "Yes," agreed Lycia, unflustered. "But we're not taking the whole fleet there, just a small strike force, a quick strike to destabilize their lines. Meanwhile, the main fleet can use another route to escape." Leon frowned. "You're suggesting a suicide attack." "It's not suicidal if it's well planned," replied Lycia. "I've done it before. They won't be expecting it." Kyle nodded slowly. "She's right. It's risky, but it can work. We need to divert their attention, and this gives us a real chance." Arlen hesitated, but finally gave in. "Very well, but you'll have to lead this attack, Kyle, and only take volunteers." Hours later, Kyle was in the Star Watch hangar, inspecting the small fleet he would use in the attack. They were fast and agile ships, designed for maneuvering in difficult terrain like the debris field. Lycia was at his side, adjusting the equipment she had received. "You didn't have to do that," said Kyle as he watched her. Lycia shrugged. "Someone has to make sure you don't screw it up." Kyle laughed softly. "You really know how to motivate a team." "I'm practical," she replied, with a slight smile. "And practice is what's going to keep us alive out there." The attack fleet took off in silence, moving like shadows through the void of space. Lycia was in the lead ship with Kyle, her eyes fixed on the controls as he piloted. The debris field appeared on the display, a tangle of twisted metal and ship carcasses that seemed frozen in time. "We're coming in," Kyle announced over the comm channel. "Hold formation." The ships plunged into the maze of debris, moving with precision as Lycia guided Kyle. On the radar, the Drakon signals began to react, but it was too late for them to organize a full defense. The small Alliance fleet launched a flurry of rapid attacks, destroying strategic points and forcing the Drakons to retreat. In the middle of the battle, Kale looked at Lycia. She was focused, but there was a sparkle in her eyes that he had never seen before. It was more than determination. It was hope. And at that moment, he realized that perhaps he was beginning to feel the same way. The Alliance ships snaked through the debris field, their engines emitting a faint hum as they moved between gigantic chunks of floating metal. The starlight barely illuminated the chaos frozen in space, creating a dark and claustrophobic scene. Every move had to be calculated, every mistake potentially fatal. Lycia kept her eyes fixed on the radar as Kyle piloted. She was a firm voice at his side, guiding him through the narrowest of routes. Each instruction was brief but precise, which Kyle appreciated. He knew that, in the heat of the moment, wasting time with unnecessary words could mean the end. "There," she said, pointing to a gap in the field ahead. "They don't expect anyone to use that route, but be careful. It's narrow." Kale nodded, expertly adjusting the controls. The ship turned and entered the passage indicated, scraping lightly against a metal plate that floated on the edge. Behind them, the other ships followed, keeping tight formation. On the radar, the Drakon forces were beginning to react. Small red dots appeared on the screen, indicating patrol ships advancing towards the attack fleet. "They're coming," Kale muttered. "Let them come," replied Lycia, her eyes narrowing with a predatory glint. "The closer they get, the more vulnerable they are." The first wave of Drakon ships appeared on the main display. They were fast and aggressive, like hungry flies looking to devour easy prey. But the Alliance ships were ready. The pilots had already been instructed not to engage the enemy directly. Instead, the aim was to dodge, deceive, and strike where it would be most effective. Kale activated the weapon systems but kept his focus on piloting. "Give me a target," he said to Licia. She analyzed the radar, her fingers sliding across the controls to highlight the vulnerable areas. "That cruiser on the right. He's running the patrols. Take him out of the picture and they'll disorganize." Kyle followed instructions, maneuvering his ship in a wide arc before firing a torpedo straight into the cruiser's flank. The explosion lit up the debris field, and Licia smiled, satisfied. "One less," she commented. "Don't get too comfortable," replied Kyle, turning the ship to avoid the wreckage of the destroyed cruiser. "We still have more coming." The combat continued, each second more intense. Licia showed an unexpected talent for predicting the Dracon's movements, guiding Kyle and the other pilots to avoid ambushes. Despite the unfavorable odds, the small squadron was managing to keep their enemies busy. But then, something changed. The radar beeped urgently, indicating the arrival of a new Draken ship. Kyle looked at the screen and his stomach churned. It was a destroyer, a huge ship, equipped with heavy weapons and almost impenetrable shields. "That complicates things," he said. "It changes everything," replied Licia, her eyes fixed on the growing silhouette of the destroyer. The smaller Draken ships retreated momentarily, reorganizing themselves under the giant's protection. The destroyer began to fire, and each shot was like a crushing fist, detonating pieces of debris and forcing the Alliance ships to scatter. "We can't engage it directly," said Kyle, "nor do we have enough firepower." "We don't need to destroy it," Licia retorted. "We just need to disable it long enough for the fleet to escape." Kyle frowned. "And how exactly do we do that?" Licia pointed to the hologram on the panel. "They have shield generators located at the bottom. Deactivate those generators, and they'll be vulnerable." Kyle pressed the controls, thinking fast. "And you think they'll let us get that close?" "No," she replied, with a mischievous smile. "That's why we need to distract them." Kyle transmitted instructions to the remaining ships. "Dispersal formation. We'll keep them busy while we attack the generators. Focus on the destroyer." The Alliance ships split up, moving in opposite directions to confuse the Drakon sensors. Kale and Licia led a small team towards the bottom of the destroyer, while the others drew the heavy fire away. The shield generators were well protected, but not invulnerable. Licia programmed the torpedoes to hit the right spots, and Kyle maneuvered the ship with precision. Under a hail of gunfire, they managed to get close enough to fire. "Now!" shouted Licia, pressing the launch button. The torpedoes hit the generators with an impressive explosion. The destroyer shook, and the lights on its structure began to flicker. "Shields down!" announced Licia, with a hint of triumph in her voice. "Now, it's time to run." As the destroyer struggled to recover, Kale ordered the remaining ships to withdraw. The debris field, which once looked like a claustrophobic labyrinth, was now an escape route. The Alliance ships escaped one by one, moving out of reach of the Drakons. Kale maneuvered his ship to follow the last ones. "We made it," he said, but his voice was tense. Licia looked at him. "You don't sound convinced." "Because they're going to reorganize," Kale replied, "and when they do, it will be worse." When they finally met up with the main Alliance fleet, Kyle and Licia were exhausted. The tension of the battle still weighed on them, but the mission had been a success, at least for the time being. In the Star Watch command room, Kyle presented the mission report. Arlen and Leon listened in silence, and even Arlen, who always had something to criticize, couldn't find fault. "You've managed to give us time," said Leon. "Now we need to use it well." Kyle nodded, but his gaze was on Licia. She was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, seemingly oblivious to the discussion, but he knew she was listening to every word. When the meeting was over, Kale followed her out into the corridor. "You were amazing out there," he said. She gave a tired smile. "You weren't so bad yourself." Kyle hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "You could have run away," he said at last, "but you stayed. Why?" Licia stopped, turning to him. "Maybe I found something worth staying for," she said, without taking her eyes off him. Kyle felt a lump in his throat, but didn't reply. Instead, he just nodded. The Alliance fleet was on the move again, crossing a remote region of the galaxy known for its unstable plasma fields. Although the route was dangerous, it was the only viable option to avoid another Drakon ambush. The ships traveled in compact formation, their shields vibrating gently as they repelled the energetic particles from the surrounding space. Kyle was in the Star Surveillance Command Center, watching the monitors while his team kept an eye on the sensors. The battle in the debris field was still fresh in everyone's memory, and the threat of another confrontation hung over them like a blade about to fall. "Scan report," Kyle asked, without taking his eyes off the main display. "No Drakon signals in the vicinity," replied Leon. "But that doesn't mean we're safe. They could be waiting for us to get deeper into the plasma fields before attacking." Kyle nodded, running his hand over his chin. He knew Leon was right. The Drakons were ruthless, and rarely let their prey escape without pursuit. The Alliance's only advantage was the temporary lead they had gained thanks to their daring maneuver in the debris field. But that wouldn't last forever. In the rest ward, Lycia was sitting in a corner, cleaning a blade she had recovered during the last confrontation. The surroundings were silent, except for the low hum of the life support systems. Although she was officially under Alliance protection, she knew that many saw her as an intruder. It wasn't the first time she'd faced suspicious looks, but now there was something different. She felt a new weight, a weight that came from her connection with Kyle. "You always look busy," said a voice behind her. Lycia looked over her shoulder and saw Leon leaning against the wall. He was watching her with an indecipherable expression, his arms crossed. "Keeping busy is better than being vulnerable," Lycia replied, turning her attention back to the blade. Leon stepped forward, pulling out a chair to sit opposite her. "Kyle trusts you," he said directly. "That's not something that happens easily." Lycia raised her eyes to him. Do you trust me?" "I trust Kyle's judgment," Leon replied, "but that doesn't mean I won't keep an eye on you." Lycia gave a slight smile. "Trust isn't something I expect, but I can assure you that if you're worried about me, you're wasting your energy. Your enemy isn't me." "I hope you're right," said Leon, before getting up and leaving. Back in the command room, Kyle was focused on the next step of the mission. He knew that, as well as escaping from the Drakons, they needed to find a safe place to refuel and recalibrate the fleet's systems. The plasma fields were testing the limits of the ships, and the risk of critical failures was increasing by the hour. "Captain, we've detected something unusual ahead," said an officer at the sensor terminal. "An energy pattern that doesn't match the surrounding plasma." "Project it on the main screen," ordered Kyle. The display showed an anomaly in the plasma field, a kind of swirl of energy that seemed to pulsate like a heart. The readings indicated high levels of radiation, but also suggested that there was something artificial at the center. "What's that?" asked Leon, approaching the display. Kyle narrowed his eyes. "I don't know, but it looks dangerous." "Maybe we should divert," suggested Leon. Before Kyle could reply, Lycia entered the control room. She looked at the display and immediately tensed up. "This isn't natural," she said, approaching the panel. "The Drakons use similar technology to create energy traps. They may be expecting you to go through with it." Kyle looked at her, frowning. "Are you sure?" Lycia nodded. "Not completely, but if I were them, that's exactly what I'd do. It's a classic tactic. Lure the fleet into an unstable plasma field and attack it when the systems start to fail." Kyle pondered for a moment. If Lycia was right, going ahead would be suicide, but diverting also meant losing precious time and potentially falling into another ambush. "Captain," interrupted the sensor officer, "we've detected a Drakon ship approaching. It's alone." Kyle frowned. "Course projection." "It's heading straight for the anomaly," replied the officer. "Then it's a decoy," said Lycia. "They want you to follow." Kyle made his decision quickly. "Change course," he ordered. "We'll detour around the southern flank. We can't risk going through the anomaly." Leon looked at him. "What if they're waiting there too? Then at least we'll be out of their trap," Kyle replied. Prepare all ships for evasive maneuvers. The fleet changed course, moving slowly around the plasma field. However, the movement didn't seem to have gone unnoticed. The sensors detected more Drakon ships emerging on the flanks, forming a barrier that slowly surrounded them. "We're being pressured," said Leon, watching the hologram. "They're forcing us into the plasma field." Kale looked at Lycia. "Your friends have a talent for making everything difficult." She laughed dryly. "They're not my friends, and it won't stop until they think they've won." As the Drakons tightened their siege, Kale made another bold decision. "Let's pretend we're retreating," he said. "All ships, slow down and prepare a defensive formation. I want it to look like we're out of options." "That's a dangerous bluff," said Lycia, crossing her arms. "It's a risk we have to take," replied Kyle. "If they think they have us cornered, they could make a mistake." The Alliance ships slowed down, positioning themselves in a tight formation. The Drakon ships advanced, confident that the fleet was on the verge of collapse. It was exactly what Kyle had expected. When the Drakons were close enough, Kyle gave the order. "Now!" All the Alliance ships activated their thrusters to the maximum, launching in a coordinated maneuver that took them directly into a narrow corridor between the Drakon forces. The ships fired in unison, making their way through a gap in the encirclement. The fleet passed through the plasma field, leaving the Drakon ships behind. Despite some damage, the Alliance ships were intact. Kyle let out a sigh of relief, but knew that the victory was temporary. Later, in the star surveillance hangar, Kale found Lycia watching the stars through the window of a secluded compartment. He approached, stopping next to her. "You were right about the trap," he said. "Without you, we wouldn't have escaped." Lycia looked at him, her expression serious. "I only did what was necessary." "That's something you do well," Kale replied, with a slight smile. She watched him for a moment before looking up at the stars. "Do you think it will ever end? The war? The Drakons? All of it?" Kyle sighed. "I don't know. But I do know that as long as we have people like you around, we might have a chance." The corridors of the Star Watch were quieter than Kyle had expected, but the weight of the impending battle hung over everyone. The Alliance fleet was reaching its limits. Supplies were running low, shields needed repair, and the Drakons showed no signs of giving up. It was only a matter of time before the fleet was cornered for good. Kyle knew there was no room for further retreat. He was in the command center, surrounded by holographic maps and monitors flashing with data on enemy movements. Lycia stood beside him, her face marked by tension, but her eyes shone with the same fierce determination he had learned to recognize. "We have to fight," said Kale, breaking the silence. "We can't keep running away. If we don't face the Drakons now, they will slowly destroy us." Leon, standing on the other side of the command table, shook his head. "I agree, but we're at a disadvantage. They have more ships, more weapons, and we're exhausted." "That's true," said Lycia, crossing her arms. "But they also have something we can use against them." Kale turned to her. "What are you thinking?" "Pride," replied Lycia. "The Drakons are brutal strategists, but they believe they are invincible. We can use that to our advantage." She approached the holographic map and pointed to a nearby star system. "Here, it's a system with a dense and unstable asteroid belt. If we can lure them there, we can create a trap." Leon frowned. "And how do we do that without being destroyed in the process?" Lycia looked at Kale. "We make them think they've won." Hours later, the Alliance fleet was on the move again, heading for the star system Lycia had indicated. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Kale would lead the fleet into the asteroid belt, while a small strike force, commanded by Lycia, would flank the Drakons and create enough chaos to confuse their formation. When the time was right, the asteroids would be used as weapons, taking advantage of their natural instability. Kyle was on the bridge of the Star Watch, giving the last instructions to his team. "Remember, this only works if they believe we're retreating. We have to look desperate, but still able to fight hard enough to get their attention." Leon nodded. "What if something goes wrong?" "Then we do what we always do," Kyle replied. "We fight to the end." On the attack ship, Lycia adjusted her combat suit while reviewing the controls. The small fleet under her command was made up of volunteer pilots, people who had seen up close what the Drakons were capable of and were willing to risk everything to change the course of the war. "We're ready," said one of the pilots over the comm. Lycia smiled slightly. "Then let's give them something to remember." The Drakons soon appeared. On the star surveillance radar, the enemy ships appeared like a red wave, advancing confidently through the void of space. Kyle tightened the controls, watching the enemy formation as his fleet made the transition to the asteroid belt. "They're taking the bait," said Leon, with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Hold the formation," replied Kyle. "We can't let them realize the plan until it's too late." The Alliance ships began firing, but it was a calculated attack, just enough to keep the Drakons interested, but not enough to provoke a full counterattack. However, even with the plan in place, Kyle knew that success depended on Lycia. On the opposite side of the battlefield, Lycia and her small fleet were maneuvering in silence, moving around the edges of the asteroid belt. Its pilots were focused, following every command with precision. In Lycia's viewfinder, the Drakons looked like sleeping giants, confident that victory was in their hands. "In position," said one of the pilots. Lycia pressed the controls, activating the communication channel with Kyle. "We're ready. Tell me when." "Wait for my signal," replied Kyle. His voice was firm, but there was a tone that Lycia recognized. Concern. She smiled, even if he couldn't see it. "I know what I'm doing, Kyle." "I hope you do," he replied, before cutting the transmission. The confrontation began in earnest when the Alliance fleet entered the densest part of the asteroid belt. The Drakon ships advanced aggressively, but the terrain was treacherous. Even with their numerical superiority, the Drakons had difficulty maneuvering between the gigantic chunks of floating rock. "Now, Lycia," said Kyle over the comm, "show them what you're capable of." Lycia smiled. "With pleasure." She and her fleet emerged from the darkness, attacking the Drakon's flank with lethal precision. The first shots destroyed 2 enemy ships before they even realized what was happening. Confusion gripped the Drakon ranks, and Lycia made the most of every second. "Keep pressing," she ordered. "Don't let them reorganize." Meanwhile, Kale led the Star Watch and the rest of the fleet to the center of the asteroid belt. He knew the battle would be decided there, but he had to wait for the right moment. The Drakons reacted quickly, redirecting their forces to face the threat from Lycia. This gave the Alliance's main fleet the opening it needed. Kale activated the star surveillance weapon systems and began firing at the largest asteroids around. "We're creating the collapse," he announced. "Everyone retreat to a safe distance." The shots hit the asteroids hard, and the gigantic formations began to crumble. Fragments of rock scattered into space, creating a lethal storm that hit both the Alliance and Drakon ships. But while the Alliance fleet was prepared, the Drakons were taken by surprise. Explosions lit up the belt as Drakon ships were destroyed or damaged by debris. The enemy formation began to crumble, and the survivors retreated, unable to sustain the attack. When the battle was finally over, Kale let out a deep sigh. "Open transmission," he said. "I want all ships checking for damage and searching for survivors." He looked at the radar, searching for Lycia's signal. When he finally saw her, he felt a weight come off his shoulders. "Lycia, are you there?" he asked over the comm. "I am," she replied, her voice tired but full of satisfaction. Still in one piece, Kale smiled. "Good work." Later, in the Star Watch command room, Kale gathered his team to review the outcome of the battle. Despite the losses, the Alliance had won an important victory. The Drakons were retreating, and the fleet finally had time to reorganize. Lycia entered the room, her flight suit still covered in soot and battle marks. She found Kale in the center of the room, surrounded by holographic maps. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Kale corrected, looking at her. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." Lycia gave a half smile but didn't reply. Instead, she walked over to the hologram, looking at the star systems represented there. "So, what's the next step?" she asked. Kale watched her for a moment before answering. "We're still fighting, but this time, we know we can win." She looked at him, her eyes shining with a new determination. "Then I guess we'd better get started." Cale nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. The war was still far from over, but with Lycia by his side, he knew they had a real chance of changing the course of history together. Hey, don't leave yet. Go to our card and enjoy all the videos. Don't forget to leave a like and comment on which part was the coolest for you. See you, Earthling.